There we go. Got it. All right, we should be live. Testing, testing. Yeah, it's on now. All right. Perfect. So we are here once again for episode number 3 of the Global Black Forum with my brother Sabelo. I'm gonna butcher this, but I'm gonna try. My brother Sabelo Mcinziba or Mcinziba. There we go. Directly in Cape Town right now, I'm assuming. You could be at another part of the country. My apologies. I'm going to introduce you really quickly just so we can jump in because we have much to discuss. And apologies to our audience for any technological delays or glitches. We will again produce this in another format in the future. So he will definitely be back on the show to share this wealth of information. So Sabelo is actually a Cape Town-based activist and researcher who is preoccupied with the question of the human throughout history. He curates audience-based and audience-participatory and collaborative walking tours in urban and rural settings throughout South Africa as a way to popularize history outside of formal academic settings. The tours act as an invitation to study patterns expressed through paths of dependence and historical recurrence through is this the longue durée approach?
Longue durée.
Longue
Yeah,
durée.
it's a French. Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, so I wanted to make sure, again, I was pronouncing that right. You see I'm butchering everything up. And you are committed to intellectual work that rehumanizes the dehumanized by reimagining alternative human or humane futures. So once again, brother, thank you for joining us today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I see you, Sawubona. Thank you again for joining, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, my brother. I look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. We have so much. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump right into it. I'm going to introduce a little bit about South Africa as well as yourself, just so you can do that. And then we can have our in-depth conversation. So for those who are a little bit unfamiliar, South Africa is now known as the Rainbow Nation, and it has a deep and rich history, which includes several indigenous populations, as well as a colonial past with the British and the Dutch. Considering your heritage, Sabelo, and your family status as members of a majority population that continues to experience different forms of subjugation or oppression, I would like to know what parts of South Africa's history and your family's history are most important to you.
I think for a lot of who are Pan-Africanists in our orientation, the answer to that question is clear, and it is land first. Land and all else shall follow. This has been the clarion call from all the self-respecting Africanists in South Africa. And the reason for putting land first is because all of these things around South Africa's wealth, South Africa's occupation, colonial occupation, have pretty much orbited around land. And so for a lot of us, for a lot very on the importance of land, not only as central but also as primal. So the first important thing we move with is land, and this remains important in other. And we'll talk a little bit later about legacies of colonialism. We'll talk about how land is tested precisely because it has not been solved historically. So I think for us, I think for a lot of South Africans, when I speak about land issues, houselessness, have to do with land. A lot of people in the cities that are in now town are cramped communities like Kaija, where you visited, and people are packed on top of each other while we have major golf courses in neighboring neighborhoods, like one neighborhood next to the other. Each of them have golf courses in the suburbs. And suburbs in South Africa is usually shorthand for the areas that were declared white areas under the Group Area Act. So anything that I could say, how I may say it, lead down to the question of land. So just to reiterate that it's not only a central question, but it is also a primary question.
No, that makes sense. And for those of us, again, who are, I would say, inclined to support Black liberation causes, it should not be unfamiliar to us to hear things like free the land, free the land, free the land. Or that's what we say here in the American context, as we are, I guess we could say, borrowing or extending and in solidarity with the struggle that you are actually living in terms of the, I would say, the global imperialist order. So considering that, in the modern day, as we are now benefiting from this, as we are talking to each other, technology has changed and is changing the world at a rapid pace. And in South Africa, I know this has many implications as many industries in South Africa impact the world, and we benefit, we as in the world benefit from South African industries. So I just wanted to know, considering technological advancements, us being I guess millennials, as they call us, what are some of the social impacts of emerging technologies in Mcinziba?
Technology is a difficult one for us to make sense in the continent for a couple of reasons. One is that our relationship with the entire ICT industry is that we still have a very extractivist relationship with regards to technology. This platform that we are using currently is not African, and if we were using this platform, we would use another one which would also not be African. So a lot of Africans, whichever platforms we are engaged in on social media, or even for telecom services such as these ones, we are constantly being mined for our data. And this is a huge problem that continues the legacy of colonialism. I think a lot of Africans alive to ICT challenges are working to ensure that build infrastructure in Africa that will support digital infrastructure, digital physical infrastructure in terms of cabling, bulk infrastructure, and a lot of other things that we've been struggling with as a continent from day one of earliest liberation experiments. We can look in Ghana, for instance, with Nkrumah and the struggles of building bulk infrastructure in places like that. And every country that has followed thereafter has been trapped into neo-colonial rules, in essence, that sees to it that we don't get to control the tools that we use for communication in Africa. Even though a lot of resources are used for communication, like laptops, cell phones, and iPads, and all these things, they're produced by materials that come from Africa. So the mining is at several levels. There's the mining at the level of the intellectual property of African people, where we need to communicate with each other through these platforms. But there's also the physical extraction of our resources from underneath the ground that is mined out of Africa, and in a lot of cases, poorly accounted for And in some cases, these companies establish a chain of other companies where they basically have subsidiaries that belong to the same chain, pretending to be various businesses, and they find ways of taking out money of the continent through what is called illicit financial outflows.
Wow.
And I see some of the industries that are incredibly of. And in places like the Congo, for instance, it's straight up looting. There's no pretense there. There's no accountability that happens at the national level on who's actually mining how much coltan and other resources that are happening. So the ICT question for us in Africa is a very deep and multi-layered question. So at the level of having the material resources that make these very devices that we use to communicate to the extractivist relation. Also at the level of social and business exchanges, it's still extractivist. We don't necessarily have the bulk infrastructure that's required to host the necessary ICT to revolutionize African commission. Having said all of this, I spent a bit of time in Tanzania, and I'm very happy to have connected with a brother working in Tanzania by the name of Femi Omere. And Femi is of Nigerian descent, but based in a brand platform called Hosted Africa. So you can check hostedinafrica.com, and it is a blend of some of the interface that we have insofar as these social media networks are concerned. It is also a blend of both social media plus a networking platform for opportunities for hosting podcasts, for doing to-end encrypted instant services, messaging services, and so on. And for me, Hosted in Africa is a wonderful opportunity of what it will look like for us in Africa to have our own social media platforms that are not geared to mining our data and selling it to corporations, which in turn, do all kinds of things with this data that we voluntarily give them. I think there is something important here that we need to be looking into insofar as ICT is concerned. Then I'll say one or two more things to round up this point.
Take your time.
Transport. Okay, thank you. Transportation is also really important, right? If we had the ICT side of things ready, and we need to move goods from different parts of the continent, we need to have proper transport corridors. And this begins, for me at least, with my bias, begins with rail. And we had rail that connected much of African countries together. We have a lot of goods moving in between the continent in ways that are slightly more protected. So I think it's important that we have this conversation constantly, because right now we have African leaders being signatories to an African free trade agreement, and you're not going to have any of the goods moving across the continent through this agreement without ensuring that your transport corridor is set up straight. And one of the biggest problems we have is that this is very capital intensive. So a lot of African countries have to use money for social expenditure, and very few have the capacity to put down rail and trains. So what ends up happening, and this has happened in Kenya currently, you can check it out. Kenya is connecting more via rail. Even Zambia to Tanzania is connected via rail. Several other corridors that we can mention. The problem with this is that it is still Chinese owned.
Mm.
The Chinese are the ones that are doing the extensions on behalf of African countries. And we can take different sides onto this. The plus side, of course, is that China is building actual infrastructure in Africa, unlike Western partners that, or at least people who claim to be partners of Africa, who don't actually invest in infrastructure in Africa.
Right.
So I can totally see why some people would support these transport corridors that are facilitated by China. But there is also a concern, of course, that you can have something in Africa and not have it as African.
Mm.
And know of many things that are already offshore. Like education system is a classical example of how you can have something occurring in the continent, but it is not of and not for the continent, right? So the transport corridor for me is of absolute importance, starting with rail, but aviation as well. It's not uncommon for some people on the continent to have to travel out of Africa to Asia and Europe and then fly back into Africa. If I'm going to move from there, I might have to fly to France and then fly back in, or fly to Dubai and then fly back into the continent. And this is a huge problem because to the lack of connectivity within the continent so far as aviation cooperation is concerned. So we need a lot of this because we move a lot of goods with aviation. More importantly, we also move people to connect our different countries and different business interests, different cultural exchanges better. If we don't have what our colleagues call the space-time compression, if we don't have that, what ends up happening is that moving within Africa becomes incredibly expensive, incredibly painfully slow, and that ends up discouraging people from making these connections with other parts of the continent. I can give several examples of how a distance that is an hour and a half by flight will take 3 days of road travel.
Yep.
And that just speaks to the state of our roads. And that's very discouraging to a lot of people who can't necessarily afford flights, but need to the commute. But it's taking them days of time to do that. So there's a lot in terms of time space compression that needs to happen, and of course technology itself is a crucial part of that. But there's a lot already that's going on that's good. A lot of African countries send money across the continent through different channels, which I believe a lot of indigenous, maybe the infrastructure that they use is not, the applications themselves seem to be. So there's a lot to be commended as far as these connectivities happen. There's much greater room for improvement than we already experience on the continent. So technology is a huge area of importance for us in Africa, and it's multi-layered, both on the soft side, software, hardware, the materials that make technologies possible, the devices, intellectual property, the looting that happens as a result of illegal mining, illicit financial outflows, and then to the side of building transport corridors, freight, road, aviation, even shipping. Shipping in Africa is not done by African countries. It's done by Maersk from Denmark, it's done by China, it's done by other people who are not African. So even at the level of moving ship containers in different parts of the continent, it's not done by us. So there's a lot, my brother, that I can go into with regards to that question.
No, once again, thank you. And as we spoke about, again, we're going to do this again. And I didn't mean to Apologies to our audience, because again, we have a lot of great questions and information that I need Sabelo to shed light on, because again, he's really not only enlightening me, but again, the world at large. Um, so we will do this again. There may be a part 2, 3, we don't know. Maybe 100, because there's so much to say. I definitely wanted to again just thank you about what you just mentioned. Several things that I could say, but one of the reasons I'm so grateful is me again as a what we call a Black American, even though I identify as an African in America, because of me pretty much being stolen. We don't necessarily understand these contradictions and double standards that you just, elucidated. And from you didn't even mention, well, you did briefly, but trade, you mentioned a lot of transportation and the technological aspect, but trade is a big thing that many people, unless they're actually technocrats or they're we could say agents of these states and corporations that perpetuate this cycle, many people are oblivious to how African states hardly trade with each other, or that trade, again, as you mentioned, benefits former colonial states. Now we pretty much, as they're framing it, but also being, I think, condescending when they say it, because they're saying it as if it didn't happen, or if this isn't an extension of colonialism. But the new scramble for Africa, where now you mentioned again China's involvement and development from the US context, there's a lot of propaganda about Russia, China, other nations, global leaders, their involvement in Africa. And America usually tries to absolve itself as if, again, we're not, either competing, or as if we don't have, African states in a stranglehold vis-a-vis imperialism. So again, I really want to just thank you for everything that you just said, because I think that you connected the dots in terms of just the technological aspect. Is so much more that could be said, Sabelo. But just again, the technological aspect, where these things, coltan, cobalt, again, we have children, women, mining for them, men, even, again, no disrespect to men, who are losing their lives day in and day out, or making sacrifices, traveling miles, to do these things that we benefit from the world over. And when we say the world over, again, that's the new concept that the European is conditioning us to think of, where we are, where I am, as the new world, and where you are as supposedly the old world. So I say that to segue. I did want to ask about COVID, and I think that we could double back to that. But I really do want to segue to one thing I'm a frame, and then I'm just going to get into your work. The It's very important for me, as a researcher, as a budding scholar who's beginning to work on my dissertation. My dissertation is focused on public policy in South Africa, or Azania, as it's known to Azania, to different people. Um, I would love for you to share your thoughts and experience on how the nation has adjusted since the fall of apartheid, or apartheid, and can you share any thoughts on any conditions that may have changed or remain the same? Because again, from this standpoint, where things are whitewashed, and you have Europeans or white Americans getting us to think of South Africa as the America of Africa. Again, I think that even something like that is disrespectful, because you have a nation that existed years before America was even conceived of, and we say different things that are, again, really, as I mentioned, disrespectful or condescending. So please, before we get into your work, your great work, please share your thoughts on the changes since the fall of apartheid.
Okay. As a way of doing that, perhaps we can spend a few minutes defining exactly what it is that we mean and understand by South Africa itself. Right. So you mentioned earlier that there are these legacies of first by the Dutch and subsequently by the British. Then you have a fusion of settler communities which come from different parts of Europe, settled in South Africa permanently. settled in South Africa. They were the drivers of public life and private life in South Africa. It was their philosophy, their ideas, their administrative apparatus which shaped the country, even to the point of naming it South Africa. So as we talk about things that support Africa, understanding how at its very foundational pieces, the bedrock of this country has unfortunately been the one thing that's still plaguing the country, that is inequality. This country was built through inequality, and it's been sustained through inequality. Embedded in the South African social and economic structure is inequality, so much so even after democracy. The economic plan of this country ensures that the inequalities only deepen. South Africa is more unequal and increasingly being unequal, with some changes in racial demographics of inequality, but unequal nonetheless. So I think it's important to lay the ground for this. The other important thing to lay the ground for is that South Africa as an entity legally exists only from 1910. From 1910, South Africa comes into existence as a legal entity. Before then, you had what was called the republics. And the republics were basic territories that belonged to two settler communities in South Africa, legally speaking. Of course, the legal system we're talking about here is the legal system of settler colonies, the legal system that recognized internationally as being representative of South Africa. So these four colonies in essence merged together in 1910 to form the legal entity that is South Africa. And it was called the Union of South Africa. So the formal name of this country at foundation was called the Union of South Africa. Now, this union was predicated on white supremacy. Black people were not included as equal partners into this union. Black people were only considered to be part of the union insofar as their labor is concerned, insofar as their land is concerned. This is South Africa at foundation. And then what happens in 94 as the new South Africa gets to be born is a slight shift that happens at the level of governance, and but a crucial one. South Africa historically, in the legally in charge of the system, they had what was known as parliamentary supremacy. Parliamentary supremacy meant that the decisions of parliament are the ones that are going to carry, because parliament rules on the supremacy of land. What changed then in 94 is that South Africa went from a parliamentary supremacy to a constitutional supremacy. And what this did to move the power from legislators in parliament to judges in the judiciary. And again, for the context of South Africa, we need to emphasize the importance of this. The calculations so far as the National Party, which was the apartheid party, was that come 1994, one person, one vote, black people, far number of people in this country, as you had mentioned, that we're the majority. So, as far as voting is concerned, there was no way that a white party or a party that overwhelmingly stands for white people was going to win the national vote.
Mm.
So then the considerations of the white interests were to say, how do you still hold on to economic power when you're guaranteed to lose political power?
Mm.
There was a preoccupation of white South Africa leading to the 1994 transition. And again, with more time, I can peel in some detail as to why the South African black liberation was clashing within each other on the terms and conditions for which they should agree on in setting up this entity of democratic Africa. But in essence, the wide concerns were to say, how do you still corner your interests, your economic interests, knowing that you're going to lose politically because you're going to be outnumbered in a system of one person, one vote. Once they consolidated this, land is at the center of it. Civil rights of Africa are the gold, untouched and untouchable line of negotiation. And once the whites got what they wanted insofar as property rights are concerned, then the other things can be talked about. You can have a new flag, you can have an anthem, and all these things that signify change, but it's very much superficial when things are considered at an economic level. And then one of the things that they did by changing in the constitutional supremacy is that a lot of the judges immediately transitioning from apartheid to democracy, a lot of the judges were white. And not only were they white, but were mostly Afrikaner. And a lot of this meant that they were sympathetic to apartheid. In fact, they had been administering apartheid. The people who now in the new Africa in parliament were jailed by the judges who are now going to administer the new law in the new country that is legislated by the new parliamentarians.
So I just want to
making sense.
Yeah, I was gonna say I just want to pause 1 second just for the audience to kind of translate. So if I'm correct, again, understanding what you said, during this transition, the former people who benefited from apartheid were installed as the new regime of leaders. And if I could, when you said Afrikaner, so Afrikaner meaning again white, translating this in terms of context, I guess a former group of racist people or who were supporting white supremacy are now, I guess, legitimizing, or they're using constitutional means to legitimize their authority. And this is prior to democracy. So we haven't even gotten to democracy yet, if I'm correct.
Yes. So you have negotiations in South Africa are a strange thing so far as time is concerned. It depends who you're talking to. Some people will tell you of negotiations that started in the 70s. Some people will tell you of negotiations that started in the 80s. Some people will tell you of the negotiations that started in the 90s. And that's what is that's the dominant discourse, that negotiations started with the release of Mandela. So even if we take it at that level, which is not a whole reality, the reality is that the negotiations that led to the release of Mandela. But we are just going to take it at a simple level and assume that negotiations started with the release of Mandela in 1990. You have a period from 1990 to 1994 when South Africa has become a democracy. In these 4 years were negotiations around the kind of South Africa that we are to have in future. And the power brokers in these negotiations were mainly the African National Congress, the party of Mandela, and the National Party, which was the party in government, which was the party state. And between these two parties negotiating, there were certain concessions that they made between them, which implicated how the rest of the other parties come to the party, as it were, of having larger qualitative negotiations. So by the time the multi-party negotiations happen and get publicized and so on, there were a lot of secret or private, depending on how you want to interpret it, there were a lot of secret private negotiations that happened between the ANC and the National Party. And as I said, the major concern of the National Party and of white South Africa, including white capital from abroad having interest in South Africa, was this: how do you transfer governance at a political level to the black majority while you keep the economic base in charge, in the charge of the white people? And white people in South Africa, the Sela community in South Africa, has always worked in a kith and kin relationship with foreign white capital. So one of the reasons why capital came to Africa in droves was that the whites who lived and were born in England saw a continuation of themselves when they settled here. A lot of the time it was the same bodies moving between these different spaces. And we can look at Rhodes as an example. We can look at many others who are doing this back and forth. So the presence of white people in South Africa historically has represented the presence of foreign interests in Africa, expressed in the bodies of the settlers in South Africa, who have obviously made themselves citizens first and foremost, and were connected to international capital. That even to this day, we have seen with our neighbors in Zimbabwe, for instance, that if you chase white people out to take what is yours, capital will also float. Because capital in Africa, especially in said colonies, still follows the old pattern. So this is to speak of the other aspect of your question. But I wanted to detail and define what is we talk about when we talk about this entity called South Africa. And I gave a talk last week, and I made the point that a lot of us who are aware of South African political dynamics know that in South Africa, there's one question actually, but it's two-sided. And the question is white fears versus black aspirations. This is the character of South Africa. If you understand South Africa, you need to understand that at the center of all political questions in South Africa are the fears of white people, the aspirations of black people. And governors in South Africa try to balance these fears of white people vis-a-vis the aspirations of black people. So whether it's the economic policies that are in place, whether it's land reform, whether it is job or affirmative, all of these things, they're trying to speak to black aspirations, which are absolutely valid, give everything to black people here, and white fears. And if white people are fearful and take flight, as I said, capital also takes. So what the ANC has been doing is find a way to keep white people in South Africa, and white people will do that themselves, they don't need the ANC, but there is a marriage that is at work. But what the for the ANC is that it keeps the capital in the country. This is because we know some of the wealthiest South Africans, they store their money in different parts of the world. So a lot of this money is being invested in the country, as you assume it would. So it's got many layers. So I think when we speak about the continuities, we speak about some of the changes, it's important to layer each of them so that we understand why certain changes were possible or permissible and why other changes were not, or still are not. Later, for instance, we still don't have land in South Africa, black people. And judges that I had mentioned earlier, making sure that a lot of the constitutional interpretations were in favor of the powerful led interest in South Africa. So the jurisprudence in South Africa, jurisprudential thought in South Africa, is a manifestation of judges that were white in the early 19th, in the early foundation. They set legal precedents that the rest of the black lawyers now follow, even though the JSC now, the council that with judges, even though now it's majority black, these black judges are making judgments that emanate from precedent that was set by white judges that precede them. So South Africa is a very complicated country to make meaningful change in, because the very constitution of the country has also gridlocked inequality and basically enshrined it into the new realities of the country. So there's no way for South Africa to meaningfully transform without radically changing the constitution. But one of the things that this constitutionalism has done is that it's created a fetish around the constitution that even the mere mention of changing constitution sounds as if one is calling for absolute social destruction.
I see that. If I may, I'm trying to think about again how to frame this, because I could see this going both ways. One, again, thank you for shedding light, brother. What you just said made me think about either South Africa is a microcosm of this quote unquote new world order and imperialistic extraction based economy that you eloquently outlined earlier, or going back to our time together in the Cape when we met, as we transitioned to your work and the magnificent, profound, and rich tour that I was able to be a part of and take part of in Cape Town. Knowing that Cape Town was known as, if at one point again, the quote unquote slave capital of the world, or a capital and pillar of the world in terms of transport, again, to me, when we look at and consider what you just said, considering again racialism and how Europeans or white settlers utilize democracy, jurisprudence, the law, and now international law to continue the colonialism that they've pretty much again started. If we want to go back to the Portuguese, or if we want to go, probably we could start obviously there. Everything, globalization is the word they use now. To me, again, it's a modern day colonialism. And again, what you just said in the South African context, to me, it's I have no choice but to think of the American context, because it seems like, in my estimation, that South Africa is the blueprint, or some would say America is the blueprint. But again, America is the baby or the teenager of the world. So even though people revere America, or we look at these, going back to, again, I'm going to use things that you didn't say, but now in America, we have the black faces in high places. we know, again, as you know, activists, as scholars, as people with thinking minds and hearts who care, that this is a new neoliberal order. So to me, again, going back to that South Africa either being the blueprint or it being a microcosm, and things being derived from things that happen in South Africa, someone like Obama, to me, is our Mandela. And when I say that, again, I'm using these air quotes or, you know, asterisks to imply to our audience so we can know that the imperialist order will use and reference Obama as a progress point, similar to how Mandela was used as a progress point. But by and large, the conditions have either remained the same or regressed and gotten worse. So we have more people with wealth, we have more people getting college degrees, but we also have more people who are living under landlessness, under occupation, under gentrifying circumstances, under unemployment circumstances, undereducated, and over surveilled. So again, I say all of that again just to frame kind of again just to dialogue with you, but I would definitely, again, like I said, to transition to your work as a human rights activist in Azania, and as well as on the international stage, using your research and the tours that you do in Cape Town as a reference point. Please share what motivates you to do the work that you do.
I think for me, the central concern, as you were saying earlier, is humanization. I think if I were to summarize what drives me and what my goal is the project of rehumanization. And of course, rehumanization only exists because there has been and continues to be dehumanization. And the central register that's been used with regards to this has been racism over the last few centuries. And by racism, we are including a number of other registers that were used to. For me, the question of how do we rehumanize people who have been dehumanized is the moving question that makes me do anything that I do, really. And this will have different iterations depending on what it is we are talking about. And there's something that Hans van says in the Nature of the Earth right at the beginning, where he says that, put simply, decolonization means that those who last will be first, and those who are first will be last. So, of course, is a play on a biblical phrase as well. But I think this is extremely accurate and extremely for context. And for me, it's exactly this: that those who are put at the end, we need to know what justice looks like for people who are most oppressed, for the people who are most oppressed. So for me, that's what drives me. That's what makes me do the working towards that I do in order to show how humanity has been suppressed for generations upon generations, but also how the people who have been suppressed at every possible interval were also fighting back as a way of reasserting their humanity. And it is this reassertion that I am curious about. Even in the modern age, how do Black people, not just in South Africa or in Africa, but everywhere in the world, how do we assert our humanity? How do we express it through technology? How do we express it through beauty products? How do we express it through clothing? How do we express it through knowledge production and so on? So every single one of us and every single endeavor has a contribution to make towards this rehumanization project, provided that we understand what the project is actually about and what it's fighting against. But you don't have, as you said earlier, black faces in high places. Because the only time and reason why that's possible is that black people who are there either don't understand what the project is about, or they have simply betrayed what the project is or what the project is about, right? So I think for me, this is very important. Guides everything that I do. If I look at history, for instance, or if I look at philosophy, if I any field that I work through, I'm constantly preoccupied in the ways in which the field also produces or reproduces these asymmetries in power. For in history, when we take only certain archives as valid forms of documentation and not other forms, that is a reproduction of the power dynamics.
Yep.
Or if we talk philosophy, and the only people that we consider to be philosophers from the tradition who were in university departments as professors who wrote long treatises and so on. That's one way of thinking and viewing what a philosopher is, or even what philosophy is. But we know that in different communities, people who were musicians, people who were dancers, storytellers in the form of grandmothers and grandfathers, these people were all contributing to the philosophy of what those respective societies were. And I have no reason as an ethical scholar to discard that as philosophy. In fact, I have an obligation to recognize and insist on it as philosophy. Now, if I don't have the tools to read and analyze that, then that's what is lacking. But it is not the existence of those archives that's lacking. It is my inability as a Western educated African who doesn't know how to read traditional sources of information. So my ethos about everywhere, whether it's politics and activism out on the streets, this is my preoccupation. How we humanize people who have been dehumanized. And in school, it's the same. I did the same approach, the same towards scholarship. That thing, the body of work that we consider to be scholarship, where is it mostly produced? Where is it circulated? Which bodies produce it? What is the positionality of bodies that produce this work? What are its implicit biases? What are its explicit biases? And so on and so forth. So for me, the search for the location of power in order to expose, critique it, so that we can open up room and space for other people who are usually left outside of power, or people who are often victims of power. So this is my preoccupation, whether it's in scholarship, whether it is in activism.
I'm gonna continue to say thank you, brother, for being, for existing, for just being who you are in this realm. Because again, I honestly don't know what we would do without you, and others. I'm not trying to, for those of us who believe it's possible, we have a non-hierarchical model, where we believe we can have something like, Ubuntu. It is a situation where I am because we are, and we should see it that way. And you actually allowed me to skip the next question that I had for you, because again, I think that you framed it so well. In a society that literally commodifies everything, we have, at one point, we were considered natives, myself speaking as an African American, but if I'm an African in America, Black people were so-called considered native, but they've conditioned us to now abide by these social systems and political systems that they've created. And again, I think you didn't mention this, but again, you gave a lot of examples. The borders within Africa, these borders were not created by Africans. These borders were imposed and we still abide by them. And we have trade and policies and all these political affairs based off of all of these, we could say, proxy wars, whether they're physical proxy wars where weapons are being sold and used, or whether it's something like missionaries. Because as we know, when they came to the continent, it was merchants, missionaries, and mercenaries. And a lot of us, again, as you mentioned, people who look like us, we have either betrayed our conscience because we look at it as, oh, we're never going to change. The world is always going to be this way. And we look at issues, social issues that are systematic, as things that are endemic to Black people. And that's, again, very important, why your work is important to me, as you are humanizing people in a context where everything needs to be decolonized. But only certain people are truth tellers, and only certain people, again, would admit that that these institutions are upholding and perpetuating double standards. So again, to me, like I said, bro, we're always going to be able to do this because there's so many different things that I think that we could connect on. And I said that in a form just to segue. You mentioned being able to create spaces to where the marginalized have space and opportunity to contribute, to exist, to be themselves, to be humanized. I wanted to know, as we conclude, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but again, we will do this again. What, in my opinion, and if this is me speaking for you, apologies, I think it can be said that women and youth are integral parts and contributors to every society. So considering your understanding of the challenges that women and youth experience in South Africa, I wanted to know what are some effective ways that you believe people the world over or within South Africa can support women and young people in the country.
So it's a multi-layered question, and I also think it needs an intergenerational response.
Hmm.
We have an older generation that feels like it is not in touch and in tune with where the world is because they're not technologically savvy like, like their children or their grandchildren. And we have a certain form where every child is born into a society and grow into different stages in that society. And there are certain types of passage, and they are afforded different responsibilities as per the different stages that they are raised in. This was the case before a lot of intrusion from abroad happened. One of the things that has happened, one of the intrusions that has happened, is that elderly people were dislodged from their significance in society. And younger people were empowered only insofar as their proximity to the colonial project concerned. Though in the United States, Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, New Zealand, and a lot of the other countries, Argentina, and so on, was a deliberate attempt at separating parents from their children. And this attempt of separating parents from their children was a way in which the colonists tried to inculcate and pass down their ideas and ideals to the respective quote-unquote native people of these different areas. Was to win future wars by ensuring that the native people have the same aspirations, have the same dreams, even have the same fears as the settler community. And one of the things things that's achieved then is a curious case of dismantling the previous generation at the level of grandfathers and grandmothers to their children, and a further division that happens between those children and their children, and an even separation then between grandchild and grandparent. So you have this dynamic that is already at play here. The other problem is that we've had a historic regression in terms of dynamics in the continent due to colonialism. It's layered, but I'll try to simplify it and hopefully not betray the significance of the point.
Okay.
When white men came here, they came here primarily as white men, and I mean now in the physical embodiment of masculine presenting persons. And one of the things that was at play constantly was the need to dominate African men, in particular, but African societies in total. So there's a deliberate attempt on the part of white men throughout the continent of brutalizing black men. And a lot of this brutality towards black men also included sexual violence. It is something that we don't often talk about because it's difficult to talk about it. It's deeply shameful to talk about it. But we know of many cases where sexual violence takes place between white men, or from white men violating black men.
Absolutely.
In what others have called the Ephemization of the black male figure. And in the colonies, and I include the United States here and other places, where this has happened, the black men who are victims of the colonial violence, which is also sexual violence, they try to clamor for power from the groups that they imagine to be more vulnerable than they are. And this is where the super exploitation and brutalization of black women and black children comes from. A lot of the times, in many cases, when black men have been violent towards black women and black children, subconsciously, these black men are fighting for their position where they have been dethroned by the white man, and this process of Ephemization has happened first and foremost to them, and then they try to fight for it in the realm where they deem it is possible. So instead of overthrowing the white man, or in conjunction with overthrowing the white man, the violence that is looped in the society moves from white man to black man, from black men to black women and children, and from black women to black children as well. Every single one of them, and I will add and say that from black children to the animals that black people keep. So dogs, for instance, I have a fascination with studying dogs, and we can have this peculiar interest of mine spoke about it another time. But the brutality with which a lot of dogs in townships and village states with people have been oppressed, you can see how the kick of the white man moves all the way from the white man through the black woman to the black child to the black people's pets. The brutality and brutalized nature of our dogs is connected to this, right? So this conversation that you're raising is very important one, and it is centered around women, it is centered around children. It's inclusive of everybody, because the healing that we need to do as Black men is very, very important for the health and well-being of everybody, ourselves first and foremost, but also Black women, Black children, Black gender non-conforming persons. The trauma that we hold as Black men keeps a lot of the historic system of oppression in check through our bodies. So we need to do a lot of homework on how to unbind with these historic forms of violence that were meted out against our bodies. We don't deny sexual violation that took place towards Black men. We don't deny the castrations, physical castrations of Black men's sexual organs. We're not denying any of this. It's very important, and the work of healing that needs to do has incredible transformative power for everybody else in our community. So I would take your question and still keep the position of women and the position of children as central, because it is. And I think there is something that we need to talk about as well with regards to Black masculinities and the role of Black masculinity in the larger scheme of things, because it's us who leave our households, and we have a lot of households that are led by women. We have Black men incarcerated higher than other groups in society that Black men exist in, including when we are minorities. So we have a lot of work to do at a level of masculinities as African men. We also need to be connecting with the question of this. We also need to be connecting it with the question of rehumanization for Black women and for Black children. And this, again, for me, with the question, how does gender justice look like for us amongst African people? How do we rehumanize the dehumanized through the lens of gender? Mm-hmm. So your question is of absolute importance, and of course, young people, they hold an important part for the future. But as it's been said before, I think it was Fred Douglass, that it's harder to fix broken men. But if we meet children when they are younger, then we stand greater chance. But what happens in a society where we don't educate our children? What happens when we take our children and give them to white people to be educated by white people? Like I said this very clearly, you take most precious possessions in the form of Black children, and we entrust the enemy with the minds of our children. We do this voluntarily. We pay these white people serious money for what we call education for our children. And what would it look like if we put that money within those communities and build our own institutions, cultures of learning? With a group of people, in my assessment so far, that do not have specific educational centers that are specifically around our identity as Africans. If you look into the tradition, you have madrasas, where the Muslims can go to so-called regular schools, but they also have madrasas that ensure they educate Muslims with madrasas in learning from the so-called normal schools. Some of them go straight to the madrasas. We don't have that as well in part of the world that I'm aware of. We send our children to education systems that were not built for us, and we didn't have the poorest quality of that education that was not built for us, that were not built for us. So when I travel through our continent, I'm often very dismayed and hurt by the poor conditions of the educational facilities that a lot of our children have. And again, we're very bad imitators of the people who have installed these systems here. So we need to ask ourselves deep questions for the future, centered around our children. I think education, great part to start in and ask what is it that we're putting in the minds of our children? Who are we entrusting with the education of our children? What are these children educated for in terms of purpose? And what is it that this education is likely to have outcome? There, we'll continue this sort of conversation some other time.
No, yeah, we definitely will. And I'm just gonna quickly respond, just to again wrap us up. And again, thank you, brother, for shedding so much light. Just to kind of backtrack off the mental notes. As again, it was like you said, this is a lot of things that need to be unpacked. I agree 1,000% if that's possible. Thinking about, like you just said, starting from the end with education in the South African context, umakulu, right? So thinking about, again, the institution of women, family, grandmothers being, again, leaders, having to, fast forward to this modern day society. I think a lot of us forget, we're younger men, but we're still, we have, a little bit of wisdom. A lot of us forget that all of our grandparents and parents weren't formally educated. So that begets us to ask the question, who inspired us and who raised the importance of education to us, and who instilled that in us? Because if that came from a grandmother or a grandfather who wasn't traditionally or formally educated by a colonizer, that should tell us something. That should tell us something that, again, in this day and age where we've maxed out or we've reached so much progress because I get to leave my country with my American passport and go around and take pictures and post them on Instagram, we believe that that's progress, but we're being distracted from what they're actually doing to us. One, they're making us caricatures, and they're demeaning, and we're degrading ourselves, and we're participating in that. And again, we uphold these double standards, as you mentioned, to go to the children. We believe that our children are better if they're taught by white people or if they go to prestigious or elite schools. In South Africa, again, that means one thing. In the American or Western world context, that means, again, something completely different. To get back to where you began, and thank you so much again, brother. I have a mentor, a close friend of mine who I met years ago. I spent time with him in Liberia. I believe he's in Malawi now, but he's from Southern Africa. I believe his parents are from South Africa and Zimbabwe. He is a sexual minority, and he was the first person who taught me about the history of South Africa. And one thing that he said, you didn't use these exact words, but the cycle of violence, how a Black man can be physically, spiritually, emotionally, and economically and politically castrated and oppressed, and we'll take that oppression that we experience out on the women around us, whether that woman is in our family, whether that woman is a lover or a significant other, or whether that woman is somebody that we're attracted to. That woman, how broken or damaged she is, whether that man leaves her, or whether that man just physically or emotionally abuses her, she now internalizes that and takes that out on herself and her children. And as you mentioned, the children take that out on themselves, other youth, and animals. And again, these conversations, we never talked about this, brother. This conversation happened to me 8 years ago. So for you to say literally almost the exact same things that he said, to me, I just think that's divine. And again, just as we conclude, I did want to share the artwork or the poetry piece that I made, but again, I think we can do that another time. Again, I just want to thank you for your time and all the work that you do, because again, I think that there's so many ways that we could support each other, and people the world over, whoever considers themselves allies to us, people like to say, that we can be allies in times like these. Or comrades. I do believe that that's possible. So again, this is I am willing to quote unquote take a non-racial lens, but we didn't even talk about Robert Sobukwe or the Pan-African Congress. So there's so many other things that I really just want to pick your brain on. So I'm going to tell this audience that again, we will do this again. Thank you for those who have tuned in. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Sabelo, for being everything that you are, brother. And please, if you have any concluding comments for our audience as we continue, if there's anything you want to share for how people could get in touch with you, please do so as we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to say is, well, first we did speak about Sobukwe, and we did speak about the PAC when I was speaking about land. All else shall follow. That is directly from the PAC. And the centrality and primacy of land is encapsulated every concern that we have. Everything that I've spoken about, you resolve the land question, you have a greater ability to be able to deal with the other questions. One thing I will end with the question of love. Very often we think of love as something that is expressed in the private domain, usually romantic. I think we need to really revisit love and figure out the ways in which we can express love for each other. This can take different forms. Daniel West talks about how justice is what love looks like if it's expressed publicly. So from a public policy point of view, it would be important to find out how love is expressed through public policy, ensuring that people who are due to have water services connected to have those water services as duty of love. That do not have hundreds, thousands of people who are shelterless, and we call what we live in a civilization that is devoid of love. For me, love is not expression of weakness or whatever have you. There's tremendous power in love, and we need to indicate this relationship of love within the self, at a spiritual level, at a physical level, taking care of ourselves physically, but also interpersonally, loving each other interpersonally. This includes holding each other to account, holding each other to account to the standards that have mutually agreed upon. So I think these are important, and then publicly, ultimately at the level of the public. And this, I think we're going to win people when people do not question how much we love them because we express it through actions politically. I think that's what I would like to end.
Well said. And as I told you in person, there's a brother I want to connect you with, one of my real close friends. His last name is actually Love. And as I said, when I met you again, you definitely remind me of him. And one of the things that y'all have the same sayings, definitely kindred spirits, because again, love is the end and it's the beginning. And a lot of us, again, everything I would say is a derivative of that. Any conflict that we have, one can say how we feel about ourselves determines how we treat others. So I think that you just said it right there, bro. So again, thank you. And on that note, I love you. I appreciate you. And I can't wait to see you again. And I can't wait to do this again. And I'm going to follow up after we end this live. Peace and blessings, bro. Thank you.